welcome, and delighted to introduce you to Habito's Landlord Meetup for September. We're really excited with the series of meetups that we've been hosting throughout the year, started physically and then moved virtually for obvious reasons. So bringing a plethora of industry information, expertise, literally to your fingertips, and then today is no different. I'm really excited with the agenda and my fellow speakers that have joined us here today. So if I just take you through what we're planning to cover in the next hour or so. Just a quick welcome from me. My name's Alan Fitzpatrick. I'm Director of Lending Operations at Habito. We've then got Kate Faulkner, our resident property expert. Good evening, Kate.
Hi there, how you doing?
Hi there. It almost feels obligatory that you're with us. It wouldn't be the same without you, so delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Today we're also joined by Paul from Landlord Action. So good evening, Paul. We're looking forward to hearing your session later. And then a little bit from me about housing demand. As I say, at the end, we will leave time for Q&A. At the end of Paul's session, actually, we'll also allow a bit of time for direct questioning for Paul as well, because Paul has another appointment a bit later, but Kate and I will stick around for the Q&A right at the end. So without further ado, I've introduced us all, but just in case you don't know who we are, there's some details about us. We will be sharing some contact details as well, so we'll make sure that Kate and Paul's contact details are available to you, should you have any follow-up matters or questions that you want to pose to them. Kate, you're first up. So should I hand over to you first to take us through rental freezes and house price falls?
Absolutely, and if you pop onto the next slide already, you'll see why. So what we try and do in the meetups is really try and keep you informed of what's really happening out there in the property market. And what I looked at, I just thought, well, how would I be feeling if I was a landlord or thinking about going into buy-to-let over the last few weeks? And these are kind of the titles that I'd been picking up, which I thought were a bit scary. So London Mayor calling for a 2-year rent freeze. We'll chat about that in a little bit. Guardian putting out about London rents falling fast. And the latest one, this has been kicking around for a little while actually, but got resurrected. But from the CEBR, who actually are very good economic forecasters, and it will remain to be seen whether their 14% house price drop will actually happen. But I thought it'd be really worth just seeing these sort of scary headlines around what's kind of really happening, what you should worry about, what you shouldn't worry about. So I've kind of collected the data from some what I feel are slightly better resources than newspaper headlines. And then on the next slide, we've got the first information from Rightmove. Now, I'm not a massive fan of sort of the average prices on Rightmove, but I have to say their rents aren't so bad at all. I think the London one is quite high compared to other indices that we do. So what I am interested though is their changes that they have, because they're kind of right at the front end of the market. So they pick up marketing prices for property, but they can be 30-40% higher than what the actual sales price ends up to be, because they're marketing prices and they are calculated in a different way to all of the other price indices. But on rents, they're actually not bad in terms of people tend to offer a property for rent at a similar rent that they will actually take, so you don't get quite that difference. So you can see here that we had a very, very sort of strong sort of start, and certainly looking at Q2 outside of London. So if you're in London, that's a different picture, but certainly any of your properties outside of London, we are still seeing quite a strong market. I think this sort of slightly over exit, but we are still seeing rents rises both on a quarterly basis and on an annual basis. However, London is a completely different market at this moment in time. And we are definitely starting to see falls there. Not everywhere, you'll see that in a little minute. But the main reason for this is there's three things that affect rents. Supply, demand, as you would in the price market, but also wages. And they're at most aligned to wages. So in this particular case, it is, however, a massive increase in supply, which has come from the short-term rental market, because the kind of tourist trade has dissipated substantially, there's basically a lot of that stock is moving out of the short-term accommodation into the long-term rental, particularly as we go into the winter period. We've had this announcement that it's going to take 6 months for us to even begin to see a recovery from COVID. So people are kind of batten down the hatches and let that out. Now, the next slide shows you what's happening on the demand and supply side. I have to say, if there's, we do under property checklist, we'll do a monthly house price report and a quarterly rental report. But if you wanted some other in-depth analysis, Zoopla / Home Track are producing some really excellent reports at this moment. So definitely worth always having a read of these. What this shows you is, for those of you that are lucky to have properties in Bradford, there's been a huge increase in demand and there's been a shortage of supply. Whereas you head to the other end and you're looking at London there, you can see that there's been an increase in the rental supply and only a marginal increase in demand. And again, so the increase is coming from short lets, and the demand side isn't that strong because there are lots of stories about people deciding to give up a London flat, go and take 6 months at least to go and live somewhere else while COVID is still in place. And people, companies are saying, don't bother coming back to work, you can stay at home. The interesting one on here, I thought, actually, was Edinburgh. And I have a feeling the reason that the rental supply has just racketed up so much is probably because we're just, normally, if you think about the timing that they're kind of looking at this, it would be when you'd have the Edinburgh Festival, where there's masses of short-term lets. So that's a very sort of condensed market. I always said it would be hit by the short-term let market harder than anywhere else. And so they've seen a huge supply increase there. And I expect that's, as you can see, even bigger than it has from London. So really varied. But the good news is demand for rental property is still strong, and that's going to remain strong throughout. So just going back to kind of that sort of looking at some cities, looking at the regional picture around the country. The next slide, if I remember it correctly, is from Hamptons. And what this shows you is that there is a bit of divergence. So on the whole, rents aren't rising that much and aren't likely to. And as we've said, in London falls. But even in London, you can see in zone 1, they're basically saying that about 17% of properties were getting a better rent than they were in the previous year. And then you run through, and actually it's quite an even split, really. Some, just under half, or maybe 40 to 50% are still doing quite well. And what I think the driver behind those figures is on the next slide, which is from Belvoir. So Belvoir is quite a big agent in this country. They have various different brands. And I've been running this index for them. It's the longest running rental index. It's been going since 2007, done in quite a different way to everybody else. And one of the things we look at is houses versus flats. And I'm going to continue to talk about that because that's an important dynamic over the coming years. And what we know is that house rentals, you very rarely before 2007 would you see that many houses rented. But when we had the crash, lots of people rented their homes out because they couldn't sell them, and rented themselves or bought something else and continued to let. And what we have seen, it's been very stark in the last quarter, is that the majority of house rentals that we've seen increases on, because there's definitely a shortage of supply. Still some areas where you'll see some falls, so it is very, very area and property dependent. And in the flats, yes, we have seen some rises, but nothing like the pressure that's on houses at this moment in time. And in the main, actually, you're seeing a lot more flat rents either staying the same or indeed falling. We're also picking up that HMOs is quite a tough market. So the way we do that rental index is we collect data from individual areas. So we're talking like Tamworth, places like Brighton and Hove, Westminster. So it's a good little index because if they cover your area, you really get to know what's happening there. And it's quite amazing how varied it is up and down the country. And then if we head on to the next one, these are the forecasts, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the headwinds that may be coming up. So outside of London, although there's been quite strong growth up until now, that's expected to disappear. It's not a huge surprise. And the reason for that is that rents are very much capped by wages. And if wages aren't growing, rent, it's very difficult to push through higher rents. And actually, it's also partly because most landlords are nice people, despite the fact that you're apparently all evil, according to the press. We know you're not. And so we're expecting, Zoopla are very much expecting rents to be about the same by the end of the year. Hampton's very much predicting a similar thing, so maybe a little bit of a fall, and Savills the same. But in London, everybody's expecting that to be kind of 3 to 5% by the end of this year. And that is, again, it's because of those the issues with stocks. So pretty crazy, really, as a mayor, in my view, to ask for rent freezes when, in actual fact, rents are falling. He has actually said he doesn't mind if they fall, but he just doesn't want them to go up. And I kind of get that, but there's no point. And it always brings home to me how little politicians understand really about how rents work. They actually work, they almost a perfect market. They move in line with wages and supply and demand, but they're capped by wages. So all these idea of rent freezes are really wouldn't work here, and actually would make your life better rather than worse. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a picture on the rental side. So definitely not a bad picture everywhere, and it really does depend on your property on that road. So jumping on to the next one, the house price forecast that came out, as I said, that was from the CEBR. They've done pretty well as an economic forecaster, along with capital economics, but I think this is probably going to be on the high side. And I'll explain that. I've got a caveat. You might imagine, if anybody's forecasting at this moment in time, caveats are a very good idea. And one of the reasons for that is that I tend to look at CEBR and capital economics for my economic forecast. They tended to go quite heavy on and overestimate what would happen to house prices during recessions. And what's quite interesting is that capital economics are only predicting a 4% fall. And that's pretty much the same as most other property forecasters like Savills, etc. We're not quite, with the sort of view is that overall there'll be sort of 5 to 10% on average. However, I've got a massive caveat on this at the moment, and hopefully that will be shown by the next few slides, just to kind of explain that. And that is that I honestly don't think any of the average data that is going out on house prices is going to be any use to you, as in particularly as investors, let alone people that are buying and selling. We know the market's moving forward pretty well at this moment in time, and I think the Home Track forecast is around 2 or 3% increase this year. Savills came out with quite a harsh forecast in comparison. Theirs was about a fall of 7.5% across the board this year, but they came out very early before we'd really got the economics under our belt, and that I expect their revised forecasts in a couple of months will be quite different. So the 2 or 3% increase this year, and we know that prices will fall after that. But going back to that flats and houses issue, what I've done on the next slide is my favorite data, and the only data that I'm really interested in, particularly when looking at things from an investment perspective, is what is the history of properties on a particular road in a particular area. And I've chosen Hackney because in London, Hackney has quite a unique tenure, if you like, from a housing perspective. They have a very high percentage of houses or properties in the area are social. There are then a lot of flats, and there is a small amount of houses, not a lot. So if you look at the past history of Hackney, particularly going back to about 2005, and I've got right back to 2000 here, what I'm showing you is you can see that the first property, which is a flat, it has gone up in value. You'd be very happy to spend 90 grand and you were 400,000, but that's a 350% increase versus a house which is 445%. There is definitely, whatever area your property is in, there is definitely a difference between not just each individual road, but also on the flat inflation and house inflation. Another area, and I haven't put this one up for this, but just out of interest, is I had a look at Harrogate a few weeks ago, and all of their house price growth or property price growth is being driven by houses. Most of the flats in Harrogate have hardly gone up for the last 13 years. 13 years. And you remember the old adage, all house prices double, property prices double every 10 years. So I'd really, if I were in your shoes, the one thing I would be doing now, if you've got particularly if you've got a bit of time on your hand, is really get to understand house price inflation over the last 20 years. We've got this data. It's free of charge because you can get it on any of the portals. And it is by far the best information to be using. Really forget all the stuff that's coming out of the papers, and please just tell everybody else to do the same. Because why would you rely on averages to look at how your business might perform during the future, or how property does, when you can get the actual price inflation for that particular road? And it tends to be road driven. So even if you've got houses and flats on the same road, they might be going up at their similar levels. So it's really interesting focusing on this. And then what I've done on the next slide, I've actually flipped this round. Now, I'm from Nottingham originally, and since I was 4 years old, I lived near Rugby Road in West Bridgford. And West Bridgford's quite a posh area. So what you can see here is that in this particular case, and again, I haven't got it back to 2000, but because I try and match the dates, but we're going back a fair way, if you think about it, for sort of 15 years lifespan. You might think of an investment, and you've got a 49% increase in a flat here in a good area versus only a 28% increase, which you'd be pretty disappointed at for over a 15-year period as an investor. For a similar amount of money, trying to match that as well for a semi-detached. And part of the reason for that is Carlton has very little supply and demand issues. It's quite an area, so the kind of people in West Bridgford will be senior managers of banks and all that kind of thing, and in Carlton, the guys and girls there would be more likely to be running a shop, or they would be working a garage or stuff like that. So it's not an area that has the wage growth really to allow prices to rise much more. And we see a lot, there's huge diversion. I know Nottingham can be quite a hefty area for investment, but you've really got to know your areas here. And I would really go and have a good look, and certainly look at your portfolio. How many houses you've got, how many flats have you got? Certainly if you're looking at expanding, if you're looking at getting into things at the first time, there is definitely something going on, and it started about in the last recession, and I think it's going to get exacerbated. Houses are definitely doing better on a rental perspective and doing better on a price perspective. But if you can find that nugget of a flat on a good road somewhere, then there's no reason why that can't perform really well. But you've got to be very, very choosy, and you've got to know this data really, I think, like the back of your hand. So taking that into consideration, I decided to do my own forecast, and I think you'll be very, very impressed with what I've done. I think prices of flats and houses, whatever, will fall by anything like, just some of them won't fall at all. Won't fall at all in the next 12 to 2 years. And some of them will fall by 20%. And you might say, that is, Kate, that is one of the worst forecasts I've ever seen in my life. What are we supposed to do with that? And it goes back to the data really that I've been showing you. The other interesting thing you can do when you look at this data is you can find out how often properties come up for sale on a road, literally just by going through and seeing how many transactions there are. So I know there's one road in West Bridgford, for example, and there's probably about 150, 200 houses on there, but there's only 2 come up for sale every single year. And most of the people, interestingly, that used to live on that road were teachers. And what's happening now is most of the people that are coming and living on that road are GPs or consultants at the local hospital. And what we've got to remember in this recession is there's a lot of people that aren't going to be affected at all. Of course, from the news, we just get all the bad news. But actually, there's a lot of people in food retailing, everybody in public services, for example, and lots of other businesses that are doing incredibly well. And people aren't going to suffer at all. So normally in this recession, everybody would suffer a little bit. But from a property perspective, if you're only going to sell 2 houses on a road every year, bearing in mind over 50% own with cash as well, and about 30% buy with cash, that'll probably go up to 40% over the next couple of years if it follows the last recession. So there are some properties that just won't do too badly at all because they're in short supply, and there are a lot of people, buyers still around, that are effectively in COVID safe jobs. And that's again what you've really got to think about, is when you're looking at portfolio, looking to buy, how many people are there, can rent in COVID safe jobs, and also purchase. The 20% falls, well, that's a standard recessionary fall. That's what we would expect. And I think that's where the forecasts are coming from the likes of the CEBR, because they've looked at previous recessions and said, well, it might not be as bad as the last one because not everybody's suffering. So we'll predict 14 instead of 20%. But that 20% is, if you take a seaside resort, for example, most of the jobs are hospitality, catering. They could be in a lot more trouble over the next couple of years, and therefore they're likely to suffer the recessionary impact. So it's all about a property on the street. So I hope I've kind of made that, my forecast is now, makes a little bit more sense, and looks like I put a bit of a thought behind it rather than hedged my bets, because that's very much what I've tried to do. So in summary, what I'm really saying is, please just ignore all these headlines. There's this huge divergence between flats and rents, and if that's not enough from this rent and price perspective, what we're finding is some people are thriving, and obviously some people are having a really tough time, and that's going to influence the price of value of a property and how much it'll rent for. And the other thing to remember is, sadly, a lot of youngsters are suffering from a job perspective, and a lot because a lot are in catering and hospitality. And therefore, versus previous recessions, what's actually going to happen is most of the tenants that are going to be suffering are going to be in the renting side. And if you didn't catch the last session we did, we looked at all the different rents and what's going to happen to short lets, what's happening to students, what's happening to professionals. And of course, there's going to be a huge increase in the number of people renting who are going to be on universal credit. And we're already seeing that coming in, and that's likely to continue. But the reason why that's important is, when over 50% of people own their own home, when the other 50% that don't own their own home, in the main are on high loan to values, in the main are on repayment mortgages. Because remember, from 2014, most people are on repayment, apart from those that had a bit of a legacy on the interest only side. The results should be, and this is a theory, we don't know if it'll work in practice, is that there should be lower numbers of forced sales. And if there's lower numbers of forced sales, that's going to reduce the pressure on prices overall. So I'm in a camp of house prices are likely to fall on average to 5 to 10%, but that's of no use to you, I don't think. What's more useful for you is for me to say some of your properties might fall by 20%, depending on where they are, but some of them may not fall in value at all. And that's the important thing. And it's down to you to go and assess your portfolio. So to some extent, it really is anyone's guess what happens next. It's, this is a moving feast. We've never been in this situation before. But the message that I just really want to get across is, don't worry about these headlines. Focus on the individual impact of existing portfolio, or look at find those nuggets of roads whereby they're sort of price rent safe, if you like, almost whatever happens, because that's where the potential success is, I think, for the future. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that was a bit more reassuring than some of the things that you might have read, and more than happy to, if you disagree with me, think I'm talking rubbish, do feel free to say so afterwards, because it would be good to chat about it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kate. I think that's obviously invaluable insight and tips as well, as always. And obviously, I'm sure, as Kate says, some of the content there may have triggered some questions. So a checkpoint from me, just to remind you that there is the opportunity for you to post questions using the Q&A button. So we'd love to receive your questions and challenges, as Kate says, and hopefully we can talk about them a bit later. Also, actually, something Kate said there, because we have been running a series of these sessions, we do record them, we do post them on Facebook, and you can look back at previous sessions, and then obviously you can look back at this session if you want to cover off anything again when we post it in a few days' time. Paul, you're up next. So
I'm up next.
Over to you, sir.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Shamplina. I'm the founder of Landlord Action. I wrote a book with Kate called The Landlord's Friend. Every landlord needs a friend now and then, don't they, Kate?
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially in these times. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a little bit of background, just a little bit about me. I mean, so I've been helping landlords for about 28 years now, almost. Set Landlord Action up 20 years ago to help landlords with problem tenants. We're a regulated firm of solicitors. Believe it or not, with COVID, we had something over 600 cases stuck in the court system because of the court suspension, which I'm going to come on to shortly. But where are we at now with regard to notice periods, and how has the game changed? Well, it's changed dramatically because of COVID-19. The notice periods changed various times. I mean, initially the suspension was going to be at the end of June, then it got moved to the end of August. And then at the last minute on a Friday afternoon, it got changed until the suspension was going to be for the courts until the 20th of September, and the courts are opened up, and I'll be explaining that on a slide shortly. But the notice periods now, so where we're at. So a Section 8 notice is a notice that you serve when there is a breach of tenancy, okay? You would only serve a notice if you want the tenant out because they've done something wrong. So obviously, historically, the rent arrears notice that you would serve, called a Section 8 notice, if there was 2 months rent arrears, you would serve a Section 8 notice under ground 8, which is the strongest ground under a mandatory ground. And you would have had to serve a notice prior COVID-19, prior to the end of March. That notice would have been a 14-day notice. And if the tenant hadn't paid up, then you would have issued court proceedings. It got changed to 3 months, and then it got changed to 6 months. So what the government have said is that if you've got rent arrears of less than 6 months, the notice period that you serve on a Section 8 notice is 6 months. Now that is horrendous for landlords, to say the least. Landlords, and most of these landlords out there, and we know 85–90% of them have 1 and 2 properties, and it could be a lot of people that are listening now. The reality now, and I'm going to come on to court delays, is a landlord could have a total of 12 to 14 months rent arrears owing by the time they gain possession. What business or what individual can swallow up those losses, as well as obviously paying the mortgage? Thank God the interest rate is 1 to 2% on mortgage deals, you know, and it's not the dreaded 14–15% as we know it in the late 80s and 90s, which were horrendous. And a lot of young landlords don't even know that actually happened. So if rent arrears are 6 months or more, then the notice period is 4 weeks. Now, we're having landlords now where there's 4 months rent arrears owing. They're saying, no, I can't. I'm not going to serve a notice at 6 months. I'm going to wait for there to be another 2 months rent arrears. I'm going to serve a notice for 4 months. Now, the big problem with all of this is trying to collect money from a tenant is very, very, very difficult, because a lot of tenants don't have money. They don't have assets. You can't track them down. They've moved abroad. You know, if you're lucky, if they've got a guarantor, then you can go after the guarantor who may be a homeowner. So everything that's happening, you're going to see the way the dynamics of referencing changing, you know, and the type of tenant moving in. Of course, now, you know, what we've introduced, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, is we've introduced the organisation that I represent. So I represent Landlord Action, but I'm part of a company called Hamilton Fraser. So we own My Deposits, the deposit scheme, the property redress scheme. And what we've introduced is we've introduced a service where we serve a notice on the tenant, which could be a 6-month notice period. And after 7 days, we also try and do a mediation deal with a tenant as well. It hasn't happened. It's never happened before in the industry. But how I saw it, and how everything that happened in COVID-19, is, you know, someone that's been doing this for a long time, I've never seen so much hard work that landlords have done with tenants to actually work with their tenants to sustain a tenancy, because evicting a tenant is a last resort. And actually a tenant that's affected by COVID-19, you know, technically, you know, you don't want them to lose their property. But of course, we see tenants that are taking advantage of COVID-19, and those tenants that have had cases stuck in the court system prior to COVID-19, where they're stringing out court cases. So if there's a breach of right to rent, i.e. their work visa or their student visa is fake, that's a 3-month notice. If a tenant has passed away, that's a 3-month notice period under a Section 8 notice. Domestic violence and, of course, antisocial behaviour, you know, was going to be a massive issue with regard to lockdown. So the rules have changed now for 2-week notice period. Antisocial behaviour, there's no notice period, but you've got to realise that is a discretionary ground. And historically, trying to evict a tenant under antisocial behaviour, so we're talking about, you know, arguments, nuisance, fighting, you know, drug dealing, all that type of stuff that happens at a property. A lot of the time, the other co-tenants in an HMO or neighbours are too scared to give evidence and fearful of repercussions. So that's an issue. And we might see landlords trying to go down the antisocial behaviour route, but of course they need to try and get a hearing date before the judge. They need to have lots of evidence to persuade the judge. Tenants that have gained tenancy through fraud, that's a 2-week notice period. Now, there is a bigger picture to all of this. And the bigger picture is to all of this is prior to COVID-19, there was obviously talk of Section 21 being abolished, and it is being abolished. And now it's now easier for the government to abolish this because, of course, a Section 21 notice period is now 6 months rather than 2 months. Okay, they called it non-fault, but there is a fault. And Kate works with the Lettings Industry Council, and I'm doing a little bit of work on the Section 21 subcommittee when I called about it. We're bringing a report out, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks, actually, to the industry, called Beyond Section 21, and about the repercussions of getting rid of Section 21. That report was written prior to COVID-19. So the game has changed now. My prediction is Section 21 is going to go within the next 12 months. I think that's inevitable, really. And really, a lot of these measures that have been put in place and a lot of the delays with the court system, and I'm going to come on to the court system in a minute, basically is preventing homelessness, is preventing a flood of evictions. Yes, it can be deemed as kicking the can down the road. And of course, the big problem with all of this, as we know, is we have a social housing crisis. And of course, there's not enough council property and social housing to go around. And of course, the private rental sector has obviously been a little bit of part of a sticking plaster to the private rental sector. And I think landlords have to change their psyche with the type of tenants they have in. You know, Universal Credit has obviously had a lot of criticism. And of course, if you can get the direct payment, you know, statistically, a housing benefit tenant will stay in a property longer, look after it better. But I think now Universal Credit claimants is up to about 2.5 million now because of COVID-19. But you've also got to realise now that there are the provisions in place with regard to Section 21 is a Section 21 notice had a 6-month notice period and a 6-month license, 6-month expiry date. Okay, and it had a lifespan. But now, obviously, if you serve a notice and it runs out in 6 months and you can't use it, it makes it invalid. So they've extended the period of 10 months. So technically, if you sign up a tenant on a 6-month tenancy agreement, it's actually going to be a 10-month tenancy agreement, because of course after 4 months you serve the Section 21 notice. After 4 months you give a 6-month notice period and it ends on 10 months. These provisions are all in place until the end of March 2021. The game has changed massively. I mean, prior to all of this, there was of course the housing courts that were coming in as well, and having bespoke housing courts. So watch out for that. Can I have the next slide, please? And of course, let's talk about the court possession. So my biggest fear with all of this, of course, and someone that's on the ground, and you know, we do about 1,600 cases a year. We have 10 solicitors and paralegals at Landlord Action as a regulated firm of solicitors, is the backlog. There was backlog before. You know, I'll give you an example. In November last year, I was in Leeds talking to a judge from Bradford County Court, and she was telling me an accelerated possession case takes her 15 minutes to read now. It used to be 90 seconds about 12 years ago. And of course, the figures now, I mean, last year alone, there was something like, I've actually got the figures here actually. In 2019, there was 110,000 possession claims that were issued, of which 60-70% of those are social. Now, what we see at the moment from data that we've had is there's something like 54,000 possession cases that were stuck in the court system because of COVID-19. The court stopped for 6 months. That's never, ever been seen or heard of before. When I've been working in the court system, from 1992, I issued my first claim in, never seen anything like that. And of course, while the suspension and the judges weren't dealing with cases, bailiffs weren't being set down, applications weren't being dealt with, in the 6-month period, claims were being backed up. So of course, how quickly can a case be dealt with? We had a case that came through the other day from the time it was issued to the time that we got a bailiff date. I think it was in Guildford County Court. That was 8.5 months. Normally, a time span would be 5 months. Now, Guildford County Court is a smaller court. I'm worried about the London courts that are going to have severe backlogs. We need more judges and more bailiffs. So they're a breakdown of what's in the court system and how it's been dealt with. The government have also introduced other things now, which is basically reactivation notices. So all these cases are in the court system. And what they're saying is, right, and this is where landlords that are doing cases themselves or using unregulated eviction companies, they're going to fall down, is what's going to happen is you have to send a notification to the court and to the tenant, ask them about their current situation and reactivate the case to say you want to carry on. If you don't file the reactivation case notice at court, then what will happen is the case will just be suspended. It will sit dormant. So it confirms that the case is going to carry on. You have to set out the effect of coronavirus pandemic. The tenant's not going to give you that information because by the time you're in court, unfortunately, communications between tenant and landlord breaks down. And I did tell the Ministry of Justice that, but they did introduce it. I don't know why. And also, if there is rent arrears, what happens is there's you have to give the 2-year previous statements. Now, they have said that on domestic violence and antisocial behaviour, and if rent arrears are over a year, that they're going to prioritise the cases. Okay, so that I mean, as I said, if you could have a landlord that's got a problem tenant and the tenant's not paying the rent, the realistic situation now is after a 6-month notice period and then issuing proceedings after that, is that you could be out of pocket for rent for 12 to 14 months. Yes, of course, I recommend using a rent guarantee company. That makes sense. But rent guarantee insurance, a lot of providers have not been paying out. Now there's been an order at the High Court that they have to pay out. But rent guarantee insurance is going to be a lot more expensive. So, you've got to realise that most of your cases, most of your tenancies, 95% of your tenancies are going to run through swimmingly. But of course, there's going to be more possession claims, more tenants not paying. How do you deal with that? Next slide, please. So, of course, if a tenant falls in arrears, have the conversation, have a chat. Are they transparent? Don't hide and bury your head in the sand and think that the tenant's not going to. I mean, you have to have communication. A tenant wants to stay in the property. A good tenant doesn't turn into a bad tenant overnight. Working with your tenant, and we started our mediation service, and we had prepayment installment plans working with tenants. Building and dealing with your tenant, and everyone falls on a hard time. Trying to work with your tenant, find out if they do obviously need, if they've lost their job, get proof that they've been affected by COVID-19. Yes, there was obviously stipulations by the government to say landlords, can try and get mortgage holidays. They called them holidays, but they were deferments, of course. And a lot of landlords weren't taking them up because they were worried about their credit rating. But speak to your tenant. How do you negotiate? Is it worth knocking a bit off the rent over a course of time just to get them back on their feet? You don't want a void period. The market has moved up now and there is a lot more demand. And of course, mediation. Mediation is where you do a deal. You try and work with the tenant. You try and work it out on prepayment plans, or actually do a deal. Do you pay the tenant to leave? Do you write off the rent arrears and get them to leave sooner rather than later and not wait a year to try and get your property back because they can't move? So I'm saying to landlords now, be much more commercial. And as I said, our website at the prs.co.uk, we're now doing a mediation service working with Landlord Action to try and settle cases more than ever. I think we've settled about 45% of the cases we've done with mediation, because we know how to deal with landlords and tenants. But if a tenant does not want to speak to you, how can you mediate? Okay, next slide, please. And what notices do I serve? So if it's rent arrears, you serve a Section 8 notice. But the problem that we have now, because of COVID-19 restrictions that were in place until the end of March, is that the notice period is 6 months, or it's 4 weeks, or if it's antisocial behaviour, if you've got really sufficient proof, it could be a no notice period. And I think a lot of landlords are going to go down that route. And as I've mentioned, the future of Section 21, it's doomed. It's going. It's definitely going. Okay, it was on the, we had over 20,000 replies to the consultation on Section 21. They called it non-fault, but there was always a fault. Majority of landlords were using Section 21 for rent arrears. I understand that the government, said, well, they should be using Section 8, but landlords are selling properties. They're moving back in. What's going to happen is the grounds on Section 8 need to be modernised before they go into Section 21. You need major investment in the court system. You need major reform in bailiffing, and you really need to embed mediation in that. And that will affect the Deregulation Act, which is obviously, serving a how to rent guide, EPC, gas safety certificate, and of course the deposit and deposit scheme. There's going to have to be some amendments to the laws relating to deregulation. The next slide, please. And, can the government deal with the backlogs? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. We're coming to the end of this talk now. The government are still looking to introduce housing courts. We are in contact with them. They need major investment. They need major investment. And I would say, watch out for the report that we've done. I'll give it to Kate or I can give it to the guys at Habito to distribute this, because it's really important that you get this right. Because if you don't, at the moment, landlord confidence is pretty low as it is. And if you don't get it right, and a landlord realizes that they can't get their property back, because of course we don't know how long the extension's going to be with regard to COVID-19 and the notice periods and the court the court proceedings and gaining possession. So what's the government sentiment towards landlords? Well, at the moment, they're saying that landlords can suck it all up. You've got a property, we can't give you, and we talked about this beforehand, in Scotland and in Wales, they have tenant saver loans where they loan the money to the tenant. The tenant, they pay the money directly to the landlord, which pays off the rent arrears. That sustains tenancies, and landlords will not evict the tenant if they get the rent, and that's a stipulation. That needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, you are kicking the can down the road. There will be evictions. Yes, there's universal credit, and we can have another talk about that another time. But there's challenges, but it works. What is good news for landlords? Well, there will be opportunity out there. There will definitely be opportunity for investment. There are going to be landlords that are looking to exit. I would say that you'll see obviously a lot of commercial being converted to resi. I see a lot of the high streets in smaller towns. I see that definitely happening. The student market hopefully is going to open up a lot better, and I see landlords doing direct deals with councils now. A little bit beforehand, landlords were quite snooty towards councils, but actually the council is your tenant, and looking at 3 and 5 year deals, I think that's going to happen. There will be lots of other opportunities, and I'm sure that Kate will answer some of those in the Q&A as well.
Thank you, Paul.
Pleasure.
I think obviously you've whistled through that very quickly, and there's a lot of detail there, which is truly the landlord's friend, providing all of that information. I know you've got to go. I mean, we've got a couple of questions that
of course.
One is from T. Is it now quicker to evict tenants using Section 8 or Section 21?
Well, it's quicker now, Section 8, if there's 6 months rent arrears. I mean, you've got to realise, I've been collecting debt for years. I used to be a bailiff, and you know what? Landlords now, it's about getting your property back. It's about doing a deal. It's about writing the rent arrears off. It's about paying a month's rent, month's deposit, just so they can move. You've got to do deals. I mean, if you've got a tenant that wants to stay in a property, you know, there's going to be a lot of rent arrears. And don't forget, a debt lasts for 6 years. And unless you enforce it in the court system, so what we do is we do fixed fees at Landlord Action. If you enforce it in the court system, then it becomes a county court judgment. Then it gets picked up on applications, you know, on referencing. And actually, a lot of tenants aspire to buy properties and they need mortgages. So actually, you know, that judgment can sit there for up to 6 months, well, up to 6 years. So it's tough. I mean, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and you know, you realise, don't forget, the courts have been backed up for 6 months. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of rent arrears built up, and that's very, very hard to collect that money. So the first objective: get your property back, get a tenant in there that can afford to pay the rent, be ultra careful and diligent with regard to the referencing, you know, and then of course look at the rent arrears situation and get guarantors. Now landlords are going to require guarantors all the time.
Okay. We've got a couple more if you've got time.
Yeah, no problems.
So Leonard has asked a couple. He was talking about a case that was already through the courts, bailiff appointed for eviction 3 days before the March lockdown. What's going to happen there? Poor
Leonard, that's all I can say. I mean, I've got a lady, this is no word of a lie, it's going to be on one of the major news channels. She's owed £35,000. She had £22,000 owing to her 3 days before eviction, a bit like Leonard, and I don't know what his rent arrears are. He got a letter from the court saying it's suspended. He waits 6 months, which is what Leonard's waiting for 6 months. So 6 months rent arrears going on what he's owed, if the tenant's not been paying, which I presume they're not. Then what happens is Leonard needs to go and he needs to file a reactivation notice. And this is a new procedure that is required by the court to say that he wants to carry on his case. I mean, we sent out 500-600 reactivation notices. We know how to do it. I hope that he's using a solicitor and the solicitor knows the process of filing that information, which I went through very briefly. So he needs to file a reactivation notice to the court to say, I want to go ahead with my eviction, and then it gets set down by the bailiff. The bailiff should prioritise the oldest cases. So his will be the oldest case, and then it comes back in. But we're getting evictions now every day set down for October and November onwards.
Okay, thank you. No, that's brilliant. Also from Leonard, I don't know if it's the same case, hopefully not.
Do you know what? My dad is called Leonard. It's not my dad, is it?
Different name, so I don't think so. But
okay.
So he's talking about the point of fraud. And a tenant taken on with all the checks conducted. After a short while, tenant disappears and another person occupies. Is this fraud?
Well, that could be subletting. The problem you got with referencing is, you know, you used to use a referencing agent. I mean, this is a shameless plug, but we own tenantverify.co.uk and we do referencing in 24 to 48 hours. Is landlords need to be really, really diligent in referencing. And a reference is literally a puzzle. You're putting a piece of a puzzle together to make sure, does it make sense? Do the former addresses make sense? Does the timeline make sense for where they were working, where they were living, and what they were earning? And that's why I always ask for 3 months bank statements, because you can see whether they paid the last 3 months rent. Yeah. If the tenant upped and left, I mean, the key is inspections and meeting your tenant and getting ID. That's why the right to rent and the passport is really important. If it works out that he's used a letting agent, okay, because obviously the letting agent has professional indemnity, they have to belong to a redress scheme. And we've had false referencing claims made against letting agents for the property redress scheme. Then he's got a claim on false referencing because the agent hasn't been diligent enough with regard to that individual and they've given false names. He's got to put the proof. If that individual was living in there and end up leaving and someone else has moved in there, well, then that's just a case of who's living in there. Are they subletting? Are you getting the rent? Do you need to evict the tenant? Do you need to try and do a deal and speak with them? I mean, there's one thing that we also have, and just before I leave, I mean, you've obviously got my website, which is landlordaction.co.uk, and people can contact me on paul@landlordaction.co.uk. But we also own a very well-known website, which Kate writes for us sometimes as well, which is called Landlord Zone, which is a breaking news website. It's been going 20 years. So you can get all the up-to-date rules and regulation and what's going on in the market. It's totally free, which is landlordzone.co.uk.
Brilliant. And we'll make sure we help share that information for you, Paul, and for the benefit of those on. Just one quick one before I let you go, if you don't mind. So has a guarantor on a tenancy, which was 2 years ago. The tenancy is now periodic. Does the guarantor protection still hold?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I see so many terrible tenancy agreements and so many terrible guarantor agreements. A guarantor's agreement should actually say that it should be witnessed and it should be accompanied with the tenancy agreement, but it should say that the guarantor is liable for the rent and damages for the term that the tenant is living in the property, not for the fixed term, for the term that they are living in the property. So if the tenant's still in there and it's on a periodic, the guarantor is liable. Okay, so when there is vacant possession, there should be no rent arrears, there should be no issues with deposit and damage and so forth. So the guarantor is liable. What I would suggest, if there is issues, put the guarantor on notice straight away, so they know that they're on the hook, because then they can put pressure on the tenant that's in the property. You know, if you need some help with debt recovery, then by all means contact me and I can put you into touch with one of our debt recovery staff. We go after a lot of guarantors quite often for landlords.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Paul. That's been invaluable, and I'm sure.
And watch out for my new series.
Yes.
Channel 5.
We will.
It's a good watch. It's a good watch.
Car crash TV, isn't it, Kate?
Hey, do you know? Well, it's just astonishing how people end up in the situations they are, and I think there's such you see kind of like the sad side of why people are having to go, but also, you know, the thing that very rarely is reported is the real horror stories of. Well,
that's why they're the stories that come on. I mean, they're not. Yeah. You know. Yeah. Listen, it's not nice evicting a family with kids. You know, but when you've got a parent that owes 20-odd grand rent arrears and they haven't paid the rent for 10 months, 11 months, and they're buying designer. I mean, last week was extreme evictions on channel. I mean, it's on this Thursday, I think it's housing scams. But what I'm saying to you is, you know, it's never nice doing that. But my cases are the extreme cases. And most of the time, they are landlords that do not use a letting agent on full management. And you know, in our book that we released, it was all about a landlord put a price on the time, be professional, you know, and don't try and cut costs and say, you know what, for an extra 5%, I'll save myself, I'll fully manage. I mean, it's mind-boggling. The game has changed so much in the last 5 years, let alone 10, 15 years of being a landlord and property management and, you know, and compliance.
Yeah, and I think, just to echo what Paul says, I mean, I remember that change on the 29th of August on the Friday afternoon, because I was trying to I've tried 3 times to have a week off this year and I've failed every time. And I was having a week off after that. So we'd written everything, we'd done all the updates. We'd done a great session on here on evictions and stuff. And then come Monday morning, I mean, the changes were astonishing. So for me, with a kind of, you know, real consumer hat on, how anybody would try and evict somebody without getting legal help, particularly if you've never done it before.
And on that Friday, Kate,
it's a minefield.
On that Friday, just very quickly before I go, because I do have to go shortly, that was on a Friday. I was in Brighton, I had a day off. And
I remember your pictures.
And I had a day off and I was constantly on the phone, because I think I was on, you know, I was in about 5 newspapers or whatever. And my wife was going ballistic with me because I was supposed to, you know, I never switch off or whatever. And of course I had to do quotes, you know, for like the Eye and Telegraph and Time, whatever. But yeah, it's crazy. And the game has changed. It's completely changed. And that's why, if you're a self-managed landlord, keep up to date with what's going on.
Yeah. And then they drip fed, didn't they, everything over 2 or 3 weeks. It was, and like you say, you covered that really well in Landlord Zone. It was just, but you know, I struggled to keep up with it. So how anybody who's, you know, certainly got a full-time job.
Kate, you keep up with everything. You're all right. That's why we will come to you.
Bless you.
Right,
I'm going to go.
I'll let you go. Thank you so much, Paul.
Pleasure. Good luck, everyone. And it works being a landlord. Good luck in your landlording journey.
Definitely. Thank you, Paul.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Right. Okay. So we'll move swiftly on. Please, just a reminder, we're still capturing your questions for Kate and I to answer right at the end. I'm just going to do a section. When we went out to the group to ask if there was particular things you wanted us to cover, I guess Habito being both an online whole of market mortgage broker, providing free advice 24/7, and also being a buy-to-let lender. I guess we've kind of got a unique stance on what's happening in the market, and definitely there was interest around, is the market hot at the moment? You know, is there a cooling down, etc. So just wanted to cover a couple of slides quickly for you, and then we'll move into Q&A if you've got any further questions. So in short answer, and I think the guys have covered this in terms of what's happening, and Kate will have covered this in more detail, but certainly in terms of mortgage approvals, I think you would have seen some of the headlines, stats from the Bank of England. August was kind of a record, and you can see from the graph there, obviously the recovery that we've seen since earlier in the year. So we started the year very well in the first few months. Then obviously COVID hit, and the market came to a little bit of a halt. And then since that, since the market's opened safely, the recovery has been quite sharp in terms of demand and requests for mortgages, partly pent up and partly created through the lockdown period. So certainly that's been a much sharper return and perhaps was expected, but there are certain things that have accelerated that. For us, from our own perspective as a broker, and speaking to other brokers actually as a mortgage lender, as we are as well, that's echoed across the piece in terms of kind of volume increase and brokers supporting more and more inquiries. So we've definitely seen a return to kind of pre-COVID levels now, and expecting obviously that to continue for the next few months, but we'll come on to obviously some of the things that may be at play and are coming up there as well. From a lending perspective, in terms of landlords and supporting landlords with their financing needs for property, very similar picture we're seeing, definitely boosted by the stamp duty holiday. Landlords looking to take advantage of moving properties to limited company potentially within that environment, or refinancing small portfolios. So again, continues to show that the market has recovered strongly at the moment. And then I guess I just wanted to talk about some of the things that perhaps are at play here. Obviously, there's a section of this that was pent up demand and that was already in existence pre-lockdown. But I think, as we've all seen, we've had to spend more time at home. You kind of evaluate your space and what your requirements are. So whether it is a desire to have more space because you're spending 24/7 at times within your four walls, you're no longer commuting. A lot of people have been able to work from home, so setting up home offices and in the spare bedroom or whatever it is, but kind of looking for additional space, and also wanting to be kind of closer to family as well, and no longer having those commutes to have to travel into the city. I think we've obviously, with the normal buy-in season being in the spring, I think we've definitely seen that shift now into the latter part of the year post the lockdown, and also some of that stimulated by obviously the Help to Buy in terms of new build scheme ending in February next year. But as we touched upon, obviously a massive initiative was the stamp duty holiday, which runs until the end of March next year. And obviously there is a question there as to what will happen at the end of that. If that ends, where will we be in terms of nationally, or where will we be in terms of a vaccine or the virus and things like that? So definitely in our conversations, we're talking to our peers and talking to the various governments about what stimuli is needed to kind of sustain the recovery. And as Kate touched upon, what's going to happen economically and to house prices, and some of it will be no change and some of it will be some change. We've also seen during this time, obviously, lenders' capacity and appetite to lend. We've seen a lot of criteria changes, product changes, LTV restrictions. We've certainly seen those have tightened and not returned to pre-COVID levels. We're seeing occasional flash sales from lenders where they only have a certain amount of loans available at 90-95% or for a particular period of time, very short period of time, first come, first served. And And obviously some of the lenders' concerns have been around their own capacity, managing payment holidays, as they were called, but also concerns about obviously affordability, with a number of people either taking pay cuts, being on furlough, or now to see if you're in a viable employment, what the job support scheme will look like, and how lenders will treat that. Obviously, potential, as Kate mentioned, there will be certain sectors where unfortunately, we have seen and will continue to see a further increase in unemployment, and particularly if they can't take advantage of the job support scheme because it's non-viable. And then obviously the macro environment and what will happen to house prices, which Kate has covered more adequately than I could possibly ever do. And then I suppose the other factors at play is that we just don't know in terms of potential second national lockdown, regional and city restrictions, and what impact that could have, or how we've put in place measures, certainly from a home buying and investment perspective, to enable the market to continue to operate. So that was just a quick kind of view from us at Habito and some of the factors at play, and happy to kind of take any questions that you have for either myself or Kate before we close today. Kate, there was one from earlier, which was from Richard. Could you clarify how to find the portal you reference, to which provides price inflation and frequency of properties coming to the market?
Yeah, so basically what you're after is the sold property price data. So the information, just so you're aware, it comes from the land registry. So whenever anybody sells a house, you have to say to the land registry what price you paid for it. And it's also your sort of stamp duty form that you fill in. That data is then sits on the land registry. So you can go to the landregistry.gov, I think it is, and you can go and find it there. Typically, you can go onto the portals, so whether it's Rightmove, Zoopla, On the Market, those are the three main ones, and you can find the data there. One thing I would caution against, though, is much as I like the price reports from Zoopla, straight home track, do be aware that the Zoopla forecasts, where they say what a house is worth, they estimate what a house is worth, that is all reliant on this individual property price data. So on roads where they don't sell properties very often, they're usually completely out. And if you have a look at, I often find a block of flats that I know is probably only 1 or 2 beds. If you look at Zoopla estimates, they're all over the place. So don't focus on those. I don't think there's enough data to give you that information. Focus on that sold property price data. All comes from land registry, and it's completely free of charge. So just work out which one suits you best.
Thank you, Kate. I don't think we've got any other questions. The only thing I was going to maybe ask you to talk about, and I know we talk about this in different forums, is what I mentioned there about potential further lockdowns or restrictions as we're seeing across the country. Obviously, I know we've put in place measures that will enable home buying to continue. Do you see any of that needing to change, or do you think we've got what we need to cope?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, and the first test, I guess, for the home moving market as to whether it would continue was very much when Leicester went into lockdown and they produced the first set of legislation to say what was going to happen. And I'm pleased to say, and we did feedback, as you know, that I couldn't see how you could locally lock down a housing market. It's not huge amounts of people that move, further afield than say Leicester, but they certainly will be moving within 5 miles, which means that you could cause a lot of problems to the chains. So I'm hoping, and I'm certainly asking for, which is the best we kind of do under these circumstances, that whatever happens when it comes to regional lockdowns, or even, and I hope it doesn't happen, we have a national lockdown again. I'm hoping on 2 fronts that the government will allow home moving to continue. One of the sad factors with COVID is that the 3 main drivers, of course, of people moving home are death, divorce, and debt. And of course, very sadly with COVID, that has impact on all three of those. So from a personal finance perspective and from a people's well-being perspective, I think it's really important that the home moving market continues. And also from a practical perspective, you know, you just can't lock it down on a regional. So, you know, but my kind of overall hope is that we have tried, and credit to the home moving industry and everybody in it, from lenders and brokers like yourselves, because you've been fantastic help, right through to removal guys who probably have the toughest job of everyone in home moving. Everybody's really tried hard to stick to the rules and to try and do 2 meters as much as possible, and the hand sanitizing and wearing face masks, etc. So I am hoping very much that we've really demonstrated to the government, along with the construction industry, because new builds and home moving go side by side, that it's one of the areas that they can rely on, if you like, not to significantly impact the spread of COVID, because we can do quite a lot of it without too close contact. And I suppose the only question will be, and I do understand what people are saying, they can go to work at the moment or they can meet mates in pubs, but in the local lockdowns, they can't mix households. So the criticism could be raised, well, how come I can have somebody come round and look round my house, but I can't have my mum come and see the kids? And I understand that, but what I would say is that if somebody does come around to the house, we have set out, and I'm just in the process of revising them, quite strict rules, if you like, around wearing masks. So certainly if you're looking at buying a property, if you're looking at selling a property, certainly when you're looking at renting, please make sure you look at what you should be doing, because the more we stick to the rules, the more likely we are to be able to remain open. And that is wearing face masks. We will be recommending wearing face masks to viewings, and we will recommend that anybody coming to viewings will be wearing face masks, and any vendors there, the minimum number of people there. Little things like opening the doors, using your knuckles to switch on and lights on and off, making sure that house is clean before and after, etc. People have been hand sanitizing before you go in and out. Do you know what? I've lived with this thing as well as everybody else, and if you stick to the rules, we can stop this thing. It's when people don't stick to the rules is a problem. So my big hope is that if we can continue, and that's landlords as much as agents, as much as yourselves, can do a good job and show that our industry is being responsible, which I think it has been to date, then I think we can even survive, hopefully, in a lockdown scenario, because we're lucky, unlike hospitality, we don't sort of, you don't have to be side by side with people to go and view a house. So I'm kind of keeping fingers and toes crossed for everybody, but we are absolutely asking to stay open in every single circumstance.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We've just got one further question, which was in relation to further advance criteria. Whether it's changed, can I raise some funds even though I'm on a fixed term rate mortgage? I suppose it depends. Obviously, the affordability, the amount of equity in your property, the lender's criteria for your current circumstances, depending on what they are. So definitely, and also obviously what other options there may be for you to raise and what the purpose of it is. I know a lot of people are looking to make home improvements and use the equity, and depending on obviously the early repayment charges you may have, what other options you may have. I mean, many lenders kind of bolt on an additional further advance if you fulfill their criteria. So I guess the main thing here is to get appropriate advice from your broker or a brokerage like Habito, or speak to your existing lender about their criteria. But obviously, depending on your circumstances, the criteria from lender to lender may be different.
Cool. And are you finding, how would you compare lending now versus when we first opened the market? What are the kind of changes that you think you've seen?
I think I think we've seen throughout the period since it opened that people have changed their criteria and their products, and I suppose the kind of the limited availability of certain higher LTV lending is kind of not something that I've seen in the past, almost flash sales of products, because lenders have only got certain capacity and appetite to be in that. And I think looking at the volumes that we're seeing and speaking to other lenders, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of demand, and even at the lower LTVs, and it looks like, you know, maybe bank of mum and dad or bank of grandpa are there as well supporting. Obviously people are maybe saving a bit more, and in, you know, outside London and the southeast they can put down that bit extra. I think lenders are, apart from their capacity, I mean, turnaround time is affected. We're hearing stories of lenders that are taking, you know, 15 to 20 days to assess cases. And then also, I mean, you know, the conveyancing side of things, you know, with the stamp duty initiative is certainly building up ahead of steam, and I think there's capacity, but you have to be in the mix if you want to take advantage of that in fairly soon, really, to make sure you're going to get through in time. But yeah, also the nervousness around unemployment, furlough income, people's changes to their income is something I think lenders are very cautious on, and are worried about future unemployment in certain sectors.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. We won't know for a little while, will we?
No, unfortunately not. I think that's it. I thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you particularly to Kate and for being.
We might have another couple of questions actually.
Oh, did I miss any?
Yeah. No, they just came in. So got one for yourself. Has the lending for equity release tightened as well?
The honest answer is I don't know, because we don't offer advice on equity release at Habito, and obviously it's not something we lend on. So I would I'd need to take that away. Oh, that Leonard as well. I mean, maybe we can get in touch with you, Leonard, and see if we can provide some guidance. But I think as always, it's about getting the right advice, and depending on your circumstances, to speak to someone qualified who can look at the market for you and give you advice about what lenders' criteria is. But perhaps we can take that away.
Yeah, and then I don't know if you want to read out the next one while I think about how to answer it.
Okay, so on demand for rental properties for families in the East Midlands,
Yeah,
usually 2 and 3 bedroom houses. Question: what is the forecast if COVID continues well into next year and beyond for rent levels in general, assuming tenants are in good jobs, COVID secure?
okay, so the answer to that is, as if their wages, say, which I expect they will, pretty much stay the same, then you're likely to see rents will be fairly stable and static, I imagine. Certainly what I don't think we'll see, apart from London for the reasons I explained earlier, was in the last recession, what happened to start off with was I think we were forecasting through the Belvoir Index about a 10% increase in, I think it was 2009. We're expecting that. But suddenly what happened was there was a ton of properties that came into the market because people couldn't sell, and totally oversupplied. So talk about the East Midlands. In Nottingham, rents fell by 20%. In London, they fell by 5% in the last recession. But I remember the Nottingham one because obviously we're fairly close to it. So what we're not expecting in this particular occasion for rents to fall by anything like that much. But if it's a good property and you've got somebody who's in a COVID secure job, my personal view is I predict stable. So I predict no increases for the next couple of years. But we could, if there's any break in the COVID situation, you could go back to the normal sort of 2 or 3%. Rental inflation over the last 10 years is typically around 2% each year. So just to give you a bit of a guide. And when wages are growing at higher than that, that means that you can, if they're like the start of this year, you can increase them by about 3% a year. So that's what's to watch out for. So where I mentioned the CEBR and I mentioned capital economics, they've usually got some pretty good wage expectations of what they happen to wages, and I'd follow them and I'd use them as your sort of forecast. But I think certainly in the East Midlands you'd be okay with a stable rent. Average wise they might come down, because if more people are on universal credit, that might mean that people can't pay the rent that they would have done before, and landlords accept a little bit less. But somebody's in a good job and there's no reason why they can't afford to pay it, then definitely stable. I wouldn't predict too much increase.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we are
Got another one.
Oh, no, have we? Oh,
Has it? Have we? Has that gone up to 9? Oh, that's
thank
nice.
you.
Somebody said thank you.
I was
Brilliant.
We have lost only a small number of people to go off to have their dinner, but yeah, we have run over, and we could talk all night. I know we could.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much again, Kate. Thank you.
Pleasure as always.
And hopefully you've all enjoyed the session. We will post it on Facebook in the coming days, so you'll be able to look back, and hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Cheers, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye.